So, this is a very special event tonight and a very special year for ACSA. As most of you probably know, ACSA was founded 100 years ago in 1912. Actually, I guess that's 99 and a half years ago. But it was founded by 8 educators who gathered together at the Willard Hotel in D.C. And although there were, I think at that point, about 25 sort of respectable schools of architecture, there were probably plenty of unrespectable ones. The 8 in that group were part of the oldest schools that we're familiar with and are still strong schools today. Schools like, of course, MIT, now 150 years old, Cornell, Illinois, Michigan, Carnegie Tech, Penn, and even one California school, the University of California at Berkeley. And we're going to be celebrating that 100-year trajectory of our organization in March at our annual meeting that is hosted by MIT and is going to be held in Boston. Clearly, we'll be celebrating the richness of architectural education as it's developed over the last 100 years. The Joan Achman book that will be coming out very soon celebrates that over the trajectory and looks at that trajectory over 300 years, in fact. But when ACSA started, it stated as its mission to advance the efficiency of architectural education. Now, maybe it was a typo in the JAE honoring the 50th anniversary of ACSA. Do you think it could have been efficacy and they wrote efficiency instead? But ironically, it started out as a kind of quasi-regulatory agency sharing the NAAB, being effectively the sort of standard bearer for our discipline of education. But I think in the time since then, I think we've found our voice and our role in advancing the discourse on architectural education in a huge number of ways. But in my role as president, I needed to establish a location and a set of chairs for this conference that gathers the administrators, the leaders of our schools on an annual basis. And so I thought it would probably be a good thing to go pretty far from the Charles River. And so I asked Norman Millar of Woodbury University to chair this event, in part because I thought it would be a great way to acknowledge the importance of new schools and of course of the West Coast in our dialogue. And as Norman and I started to talk, it became pretty clear that he had been giving a lot of thought to what the future of architectural education might want to be and what the really pressing issues at a kind of critical moment are. And he had the enormous capacity and intellect and cleverness to coerce Margaret Crawford to co-chair with him. And together they put together the conference that we're going to enjoy, which I am incredibly excited about, Old School, New School, devoted to looking at a number of the questions about what an architectural curriculum could be, certainly should be, and what it might be if we were able to separate ourselves from some of the constraints that tend to bind us. When we started to talk about this about a year ago, I had a kind of queasy feeling because as a former administrator, I was chair at University of Virginia for 5 years. I was afraid that a gathering of deans and chairs who are at their heart and core still faculty after all might start to take on the familiar and predictable arguments of a curriculum committee meeting where people start to protect their turf and suggest a certain kind of resistance to change. Well, I think having looked at the array of speakers over the next 2 days, I think it's pretty clear that not much will be familiar or predictable. And so I am very grateful for that and very much looking forward to this dialogue. So my next job is to introduce Norman Millar, who will then introduce Margaret Crawford, who in turn will introduce our night's speaker. I'll try to keep this brief, however. Norman Millar is rare in many ways. In one way is that I learned today that he is a 4th-generation Californian. And that's pretty rare, I suspect. And he is a dean who practices, and that may even be rarer. but he does maintain an active practice. He established Norman Millar Architects in 1985. His work has been widely published and awarded. He has led the growth of the architecture program at Woodbury University since 1999, which was recently featured, was it at Architect Magazine or Architectural Record? Had a wonderful piece on Woodbury and the kind of work that they do. And a school that has tripled in size and has an incredibly diverse student body and has several new graduate programs. Prior to joining Woodbury, he taught at SCI-Arc, USC, Pasadena Art Center, and UCLA. I guess he hasn't, have we allowed you to leave California, or have you been sort of chained to this coast? Well, in any event, I am so delighted that Norman agreed to chair this conference, co-chair it with Margaret Crawford, and thank you.
So, welcome to Hollywood. I'm going to really try to be brief because that's what we're asking all the panelists to do tomorrow. Because we think that's going to be brisk and lively. And with the tweeting, we think that that might even be more lively. I want to thank Judy for her tremendous support and confidence in inviting Margaret and I to do this. And of course, Michael, Monty, and Jonathan Halpin, everything we said to them, they go, we can do that, like the tweet thing. And of course, Mary Lou and Pascal, who, for all their behind-the-scenes support. Now, when Judy invited me to call Margaret, as I said, I was really excited to do it. Margaret, I've known Margaret since I was at SCI-Arc, actually since I was at USC. And she was part of the reason that I went from USC to SCI-Arc. Margaret was the director of history and theory at SCI-Arc. And about the same time I left for Woodbury, Margaret got this great job at Harvard at the GSD. She was there teaching mainly in urban design for about 10 years. And then we got her back in California. Now she's at Berkeley. And it's really great to have her back because we get to see each other a lot. Margaret has written many books. You've all probably seen Everyday Urbanism that she edited with John Kaliski and the late John Chase. Another book is Building the Working Man's Paradise about company towns. It's pretty new. And we really enjoyed doing this. And I hope you will enjoy it too. And Margaret Crawford, please come up here.
Thank you, Norman, and thank you, Judith. It's a little strange for somebody who's not an administrator or an architect to be organizing this conference, but it's actually been a lot of fun, and also really, I've learned a lot. I want to start by thanking Paolo Tombesi for flying halfway around the world to come here. But this is nothing new for Paolo, who is one of the most global people I know. And we'll see that that's true both in his work, but in his life as well. As his name suggests, Paolo is Italian, and he started out in Rome, where he studied at La Sapienza. But during his time there, he actually managed to study in 3 other countries, including France and at Penn State. And then he did his thesis there on the Australian Parliament House in Canberra. So even as an Italian student, he managed to span the globe. He then moved on to spend 7 years in the United States, where he got his PhD at UCLA, where I first met him. And then after that, moved on to the University of Melbourne in Australia, where very recently in 2009, he became the professor and chair in construction. He has continued to move around the globe, and in recent years has taught at a wide variety of schools, including the École Polytechnic in Lausanne, Switzerland, and I'm not going to be able to pronounce this right, the University of Moratuwa in Sri Lanka, the Harvard GSD, the University of Michigan, the University of Reading in the UK, and the Polytechnico of Torino and Roma Tre in Italy. And this, of course, is in addition to the many lectures that he has given around the world. And not to mention the research that he does into the architectural profession and construction that also takes him around the world. And for our conference, Paolo's research is really ideal because it matches very much the theme of the conference. As Mark said, people make their own history, but not in circumstances of their own choice, more or less. And actually, we can also say that architects design their buildings, but not in the circumstances of their own choices either. And what we want to do in this conference, in a sense, is give equal time to each of these propositions. The idea we want to respect the architect's desire to innovate, to push the discourse forward, to do things that are exciting, and educators also interest in doing that. But we also need to understand the social and economic forces that are continually shaping, and I think we would say reshaping, architectural practice, construction, the design process, and every other dimension. And in recent years, we've seen many, many changes, and the pace of change seems to be getting faster and faster. So Paolo will tell us many things about this. And I would actually characterize his work as, are people tweeting rude things? As the political economy of design, in which he combines both an appreciation of design with a profound understanding of the many complex and changing dimensions of the process of turning concept into building. And his own work has explored in many different publications the globalization of practice, the labor practices in architecture, the construction process, technological innovation, and actually design itself. So I think my 5 minutes is up, and welcome, Paolo.
Well, thank you, Margaret and Norman, for first considering and then deciding to invite me here, as well as Judith Keynote and Michael Monti from ACSA for being so speedy and efficient about the organization of the trip. And but above all, thank you all for being here. Romans, countrymen, and lovers. Hear me for my cause, and have respect for it. I'm falling asleep, but hear my words, and have respect for them. Censor me in your wisdom, but awake your senses, so that you may be the better judge. If there was any of you in this audience who was a dear friend of Caesar's, well, to that person I would say that my love for Caesar was no less than hers or his. If then that person asks, why then I rose against Caesar? Well, this is my answer. Not that I love Caesar less, but that I love Rome more. Now, as you all know, these unfortunately are not my words, but other words that William Shakespeare had Brutus speak in the Roman Senate in front of his community after he'd slain Julius Caesar, his adoptive father, his mentor, his commander-in-chief. But above all, at least in the eyes of Shakespeare's Brutus, the person who had put his own interest above or before Rome's most precious asset, res publica, commonwealth, or even more literally, the public good. And I often think about these words and sometimes use them in events like this, because I think that they do embody very well, they reflect very well the idea, or if you will, the political ideals of a modern university. And why? Because essentially Brutus goes before his community and asks them to listen to him, listen to what he has to say, and respect what he has to say, particularly when his own truth is a hard one to swallow. But then he also acknowledges that truth or respect must be earned. We can't simply ask people to trust us, but we need to show that our words are actually supported by deeds. Well, the other thing that, particularly in an environment like this, not this one of the CSA, but in these times and age, makes Brutus' position particularly relevant for me, is the fact that somehow we associate it with its hubris, which of course includes his eventual demise at the hands of a much more cunning Antony, much better with words than Brutus, at least in Shakespeare's version, which then starts, sort of setting the train in motion. Now, Brutus' words echo in the words of one of his great friends and allies, Horace, who in his odes wrote postera crescam laude, which means let's hope that the future will bring recognition to all of us. And those three words are on the seal of my university. Unfortunately, I think, without the fourth one in the sentence, which is a critical one, which is recens, which in Latin means day by day. So we shouldn't simply seek for future accolades, or expect future recognition, but actually work every day, day by day, in order to earn them. Now, another thing that Brutus' position, or Brutus' words, remind me of is the problem with allegiance. How do we swear allegiance? And how do we switch it? Can we be loyal to different parties at the same time? Or different disciplines, which in the case of the built environment, I think is an interesting question to ask in the first place. Because values, ideals, and sometimes ideologies do not go in parallel. The idea of allegiance and how one decides which side to be on is particularly relevant for me, and has been for the last 3 years, because after I moved from here, from Los Angeles to Australia to join the University of Melbourne in 1997, I was asked 10 years later to become the chair of construction. And the chair of construction in a university which essentially follows the Cambridge-Oxford model. And so a chair is the person that sets up the intellectual directions of that particular discipline. So there is only one per discipline. Not only that, this particular position had become available because, as some of you may know, the University of Melbourne decided to adopt in 2008 a new educational model, which is called the Melbourne Model. And the Melbourne Model, essentially, if you consider this as the original facade of the university, is something that tries to go back to the origin. In 2008, Melbourne, I think, had 600 different undergraduate degrees. With the definition of the Melbourne Model, all the undergraduate degrees were actually reduced to 6. 6 new generation degrees: Bachelor of Sciences, of Environments, Arts, Biomedicine, Commerce, and Music. And within the environments, you have all the disciplines that are traditionally associated with architecture, engineering, and so forth. Then on top of that, so essentially there is a very generalist degree that brings together all these disciplines and essentially gives students 2 years to decide what it is that they want to do in their life. Then on top of that, on the second story of that building, there is graduate degrees. If you achieve a particular average, you can move on to graduate schools. Otherwise, you can actually join the world of employment. The graduate degrees, this is interesting, particularly in the Bachelor of Environments, which is the one I can speak for. What's interesting is that they've been developed under the umbrella of a new institution, which is called the Melbourne School of Design. And I'm the first one to acknowledge that there might have been some marketing reasons behind it. But not only that, and I think Mark will understand what they are, but not only that. The idea was that, so there was an ideological base for that, is that no matter what your technical discipline is, if you do it properly, there is a degree of autonomy which is built into it. And therefore, it's not a discipline that executes other people's work, but it is a discipline that puts design in place. And so under the edges of the Melbourne School of Design, then we would have architecture, construction management, landscape, property, urban design and planning when it came to that particular school. And that's where the problem of allegiance comes in with me, because I decided to do so. And I decided to join the university in that capacity, particularly in relationship to this cone of influence that one could have actually exerted on the curriculum, starting from design and bringing it all the way down to the various disciplines. And of course my role would have been that of making sure that construction would actually relate to all the other disciplines at different level, effectively, rather than just administratively. Pun is intended, possibly. Now, it's not something that I was completely unfamiliar with, in the sense that my life in Los Angeles had to do with an idiosyncratic view, or the development of an idiosyncratic view of architecture. I did my PhD, it was called Travels from Flatland, and I looked at the division of labour that the construction industry has to put in place in order to build particular buildings. And of course, the building that I worked on was this one when it was stone, not when it was metal, but anyway. And as part of that process, I had to actually delve into what various people, various participants through the building process would actually do. So these are my little sketches about Gary's teams, industry teams, at work on particular parts of the building. And then eventually I further developed that to produce a view of the industry, of the design industry, that, as Margaret was mentioning, aligns more with political economy lines rather than concepts than traditional architectural ones. Some of you may have read an article that I wrote in 1997, I think, that won the General Architecture Award for a standing article in 2010, which was called The Carriage in the Needle, in which I considered whether, in fact, the adoption of particular models of the industry as a way of understanding how architectural practice could actually move forward were in order, or whether, in fact, we could actually deal well with architecture as it was. 4 or 5 years ago, I received a research prize from the Institute of Architects in Australia, which was used. It's called a prize, but it's not really a prize. It's like you're doomed to writing a book. They give you the prize before you write a book in order for you to write it. And so eventually we had to do it, and we tried to look ahead, as the title says, in defining the terms of a sustainable architectural profession. The moment you start doing that, then you have to realize that you have to move out of Flatland, because in reality, the elements that impinge on the future and the constraints of practice are by and large external to it. Now, because of this background, I then accepted and said, look, you know what, bagger, I'll do it. I'll do it and see what happens. And I started to pull together a number of thoughts. So these were some of the sentences that were most important to me. So for obvious, I'm reading it because I understand that it may be difficult otherwise. For obvious administrative and organizational reasons, teaching has to be organized in courses, subdivided into years, broken down into streams, and consecrated by degrees. But emphasis can be laid throughout the process on the need for flexibility of approach, with a view to making the future graduates more adaptable to changing conditions, many of which cannot even be foreseen. So to train future builders, remember, I'm moving from a construction position here. Future builders within a school of architecture, alongside with future planners, future landscape architects, future environmental engineers, and of course future architects, is indeed challenging. If I had to sum that in a single formula, the ultimate purpose of the new courses, I would be tempted to say that we should try to train a creative builder. One who will have shared years of common courses with his future colleagues, will have to solve many problems of design and studio work, will have solid background in scientific disciplines, and one will, most of all, will continue to share a common language with many members of the building team. Then, at the end said, by virtue of his training and because of his approach, he might find himself closer to the architect working on a development project, the engineer producing advanced structural designs, or the industrial designers creating new products and components, than to his partners, all partners, concerned with the daily administration of a project or with the procurement of building materials. So far, so good. One of the interesting things that these were not my words, same as with Shakespeare, but these were the words that Duccio Turin, an architect from Argentina, who had become possibly the most influential thinker in the history of construction academia, had actually uttered during his inaugural lecture as London Master Builders Professor of Building at the Bartlett School of Architecture in 1966, I think 4 months before Venturi published Complexity and Contradiction. So in this particular case, Turin was actually giving us his own version of the complexity of the building industry, and some of the contradictions that one could find in it. And Turin was actually brought to the Bartlett by Llewellyn Davis. It was actually setting up a new course that had to do with the environment at large, as opposed to architecture versus other discipline. Now, one of the things that happened, though, is that these words have resonated in many people's minds, but have not come up to anything. You know, it's enough to go back to the Bartlett today and see what happened in relation to his own prophecy. But I do suspect that today, in fact, those words carry much more weight than they would have had 40 years ago. And why? Well, the first one, so I tried to put 4 lines that, in a sense, symbolize some of the problems. One is the digital world. And the fact that the moment we start being serious about the modeling of all the information that concerns building, then that modeling and that information will have to be divided, shared. The moment I make a decision that is given to others without the person making a decision knowing full well what the repercussions are, problems will start to occur. BIM makes for a much more social network of responsibilities in architectural practice than it was the case before. Now, the other thing is that BIMs, already if adopted, makes practice more cumbersome in terms of responsibilities, but possibly more efficient in terms of labour time. If you consider the other two, the second line, 1 to 700, 1700 is the ratio of architects to urban residents in the world at the time. At this time is the average. If you were to Italy, it would be 1 to 400. But in general, advanced economies will have 1 to 1700. The second one is the number of architects to urban residents that exist in Chad last year. So possibly I would say that now it's even higher than that. And if you take those numbers, so essentially there are 2 numbers that have to do with mature economies and mature building fabrics, and large numbers that have to do with urbanizing areas, without infrastructure and without professionals. If you add that to 0-10, which is essentially the amount, the range of GDP growth that different economies either enjoy or suffer, so 0 would be once again Italy, 10% would be on average India or China, you will see that there are incentives to grow from an urban point of view that are far more localized and concentrated in particular areas than in others. And of course, the other thing that happens, which has always been very favorable to the architectural profession, but may not be at the moment, is the amount of disposable income that was part of the household income that was part of the GDP. Then the fourth one, 85%. 85%, it's a rough estimate, so take it with a grain of salt, but that means that it's not going to be 90, it could be 70 or 75. But it is the number, the percentage of construction workers around the world that are informal and unskilled. So the construction industry, when it comes to labour around the world, is made for the most part out of an unskilled labour, for the most part in a position of poverty and social imagination. Why am I saying this? Because as architects, as designers, we can't move away from those conditions. On the one hand, there is a technology that will expose our decisions, not only the good ones, but also the bad ones. And so one has to have an educational system in place that makes sure that whoever uses a particular system, technology, knows how to do it, even from a social point of view, what the supply chain repercussions are. And on the other, we can't pretend that you can go about designing and building everything, because that is not the case, and increasingly so. These are two buildings, and so this is an image that I borrowed from a presentation that I gave at Yale last year, I think, and so someone has seen it, I apologize. But these are two buildings that are heavily engineered and modeled. And then you have the little modulars beneath. Do you know what that means? What that indicates? Well, it indicates the number of workers that died on those construction sites. So you have 15 people, 15 casualties on Massimiliano Fuchs's site for the furniture fair in Milan. And you had between 6 and 10, depending on who you ask, either the Chinese government or I think Amnesty International, for the stadium in Beijing. So on the one hand, we have this great aspiration to model things that are complex in terms of form making and possibly technological intersection. And on the other hand, we still haven't graduated to the level that one would consider to be necessary in order to make sure that everyone can enjoy the same conditions together. And so it is on this particular, from this particular dimension, that I decided that getting a chair in construction under the umbrella of design would be an interesting thing to do. And so I went to my interview 3 years ago, almost 3 years ago, with something that looked or sounded a bit provocative. I mean, you don't go for an interview in a chair in construction with a lecture that says, what do we mean by design? But I thought that is very apropos, and it's something that it isn't a question that we all have to answer very quickly before things get a bit too difficult. Now, when it came to Duccio Turin's presentation, which is something, what we mean by design, what we mean by building, is something that I use in all my classes in architecture and construction, Turin had a very neat, polite and elegant view of the construction industry. Essentially said it has to be a Newtonian system, where all the new things fit in harmony, and there are different orbits within, around the building. I'm not as elegant as Duccio Turin, and possibly times and emphasis have changed. So I use the theory of the cauliflower. I don't like cauliflowers particularly, but I like one geometric characteristic of them. They are the perfect fractal structure. So you can find the cauliflower in the smallest part of the cauliflower. The geometric structure is the same. So suppose that we say that design, for the moment, we give a very prosaic definition. A problem defining, of course, problem solving, and information structuring activity that establishes and communicates specific courses of action on the basis of understood conditions and rules, cultural, economic, otherwise. Well, if that is the case, and if we take the building as the heart, the kernel of the cauliflower, there will be at least 6 dimensions around it that all contain intellectual autonomy in their routines. Building scope formulation, building manufacturing, building erection, building use and maintenance, the definition of the project, and the generation of building opportunities. Those who can generate building opportunities design cities and the world. So we can't discount the design impact of that component. Then we can actually start applying the cauliflower fractal technique. So each one of those categories will have another cluster of things. So, for instance, we'll have, can't see a thing here, but space, visual, performance, specifications, materials and system, tectonics, use, maintenance, and so forth. So at the end of this, we could actually go about it at libidum, infinitely, but we have something that the moment we use a description of design that is aligned with those features, the design of the building consists of a huge number of things. a huge number of tasks. And so at that point, we can say, look, we turn everything into a design activity, into a design task. So we need to have the design of the program. We need to have the design of the goals. Of course, we need to have the design of the space. Of course, we need to have the engineering of the systems and all that. But there are other components of design that are equally important, not only to our success as architects, but to the success of the city as a built environment artifact. Now, over the last few years, I've been using some of these things, and you can actually use them to set up an intellectual evaluation of particular buildings or the way in which some industry or particular architects work. So here, for instance, you have something that tells you how the Arab Arches was designed in Rome by Richard Meyer or his colleagues, and the large spheres had to do with things with dimensions that had been given emphasis, and the smaller ones with things that were a bit left behind. The red ones are critical ones. This is Renzo Piano. Normally the critical ones tend to be looked after. This is Grimshaw. Grimshaw, from the point of view of building design, works very well. Now, this is not enough to set up a notion of design that brings together construction and architecture. So in a sense, I had to rely and benefit from the tradition in Melbourne, where architecture and building are, they are kept together in a very, very concrete way, particularly from an intellectual point of view. So the ones that the cover that you have on the left-hand side is Australia's Home, possibly Australia's most famous commentary on architectural history by Robin Boyd. There are many pieces of Australia's Home and Australia's Ugliness, the other book, that have major parallels with Robert Venturi's book. But for the time being, Australia's Home, why Australians built the way they did. So architecture as a cultural artifact is also a consequence of the society that built it. So Lewis Mumford, no buildings will ever be able to be better or worse than the society that produced them. And so I'm going back in 2 days, and we are going to launch the new Encyclopedia of Australian Architecture, done by two colleagues of mine, edited by two colleagues of mine who were at Berkeley last year, in which there is an entry on the construction industry, which I wrote. And so can you imagine what would one have to say about the construction industry in a publication that has to do with architecture? It's not about numbers, but it's about the defining features, even from a cultural point of view, that are historically charged, and eventually, nowadays, will define what we can or what we cannot do. So this is the context in which I started to operate. And one of the things that we tried to do was to actually bring the cultural dimension into the life of the construction program as well. And essentially we tried to define a brand, and I hate the word, but that's essentially what we tried to do. A brand that was culturally recognizable regardless of the program. So on the left-hand side, you have a conference on construction management that I organized with the construction program, which has a novel Piranesi giving us a contribution. The second one is a symposium on the 80th birthday of Aldo Giurgulas that we organized last month, in which the protocols that we use in order to create an audience and a community are very similar. Another thing that we've done is also to introduce subjects in the construction curricula that are essentially technology and history and cultural history subjects. And this is a very famous one, where we actually take people through the various technological innovations that the different ways of migrants brought to Australia at particular points in time. And we want to follow how those technologies have in turn conditioned the innovation path of the country. Now, this is all very well, but it's not going to resolve some of the problems that were originally built into the model, which is very, very ambitious from an economic point of view, and possibly try to work as much as possible on the clout that the university has in that part of the world. We are a sandstone university, which is Equivalent to an Ivy Sandstone University here. Now, the Melbourne Model was defined in two ways. So very generalist degrees, very broad degrees. You actually have to row. You get a boat and start rowing to shore for the first year. You were in that water, but you didn't know where you were going. Then after a year, you get ashore, you start walking, and you only get to the snow line at the end of your degree, which is 3 years. So that is the bachelor. And then you go to the next one. Now, what happens is that then you have a distinction between undergraduate and graduate, which is all very well for architecture, but it's not very good for construction and other technical disciplines that historically didn't need as much time, such a long time to graduate. So essentially here, we're asking people, we're forcing people to spend up to 1.5 years longer in school. And we need to give them a very, very good reason to do it, particularly when there are other universities that are going the other way. So there are some universities in Australia where you can actually get a PhD in 3 weeks and a master's on the weekend. And so how do you actually bridge that gap or make sure that the opportunity costs involved can actually be turned around into opportunities that you wouldn't have otherwise? Now, one of the things that would happen at first is that we try to adapt the program, the model as a whole, to what we had. And what we ended up with was a series of very successful programs, but the desert all around them. So highly scenographic, things that you could market, but things that didn't actually have underneath the idea behind the Melbourne model. So one of the things that I tried to do when getting in, the moment I got in, was to actually decide whether we can justify that additional time by providing things that people wouldn't have otherwise. And so I decided that past the snow line, then we have to respond intellectually as well as technically to what the industry needs. And so we set up a series of areas of concentration. There is a reason why I'm using construction rather than architecture for the moment. Coming from Italy, you know, the Cime di Lavaredo was the natural picture to use. And essentially, past the snow line, once we're into the real master's program, we want to have several peaks. They are related, but they are distinct at the same time. So rather than having the usual occupations, vocational occupations and degrees, building, construction manager, cost, quantity surveying, project management, we actually put additional things in. So system, trade specialties. If you want to go and work for Per Mastelisa, where would you go and study? Then corporate, for people who want to have something to say about the industry itself from the point of view of the companies and the firms. Then policy, for those who want to have something to say from the point of view of the government, setting up policies for construction and design. And last but not least, research. For people who want to go into research and don't expect to find themselves there because of divine intervention. Now, if you look at these 7 things, what happens is that we try to distinguish between the vocational paths and the non-vocational path. So the vocational, professional, and the professional academic. And the moment you do that, you can't actually have a system that deals with trade specialties if you don't bring it together with architecture and engineering, because it would be senseless. You can't have a corporate management perspective on construction if you don't understand what the other actors into the process do and how they interact with you. You can't do policy if you don't understand what the supply chain is. And you can't do research if you don't understand where you get your data from. So in a sense, the moment we did this, the distinction between construction, urban design, architecture, planning and landscape ceased to be one. Because at one point, as far as the vocational paths were concerned, certainly there are particular curricula. But when it came to other ways of reflecting on those occupations, then you can actually start considering what other people are doing as well. So essentially what we tried to do was to play with words. It was suggested to me by the university that we still had a construction management degree, and I said, fine. I can be a graduate of construction management, but what we'll do in that program is to learn how to manage construction at different scales. So if you want to be vocational, then you go and deal with the construction industry. If you're interested in managing construction from a different point of view, then you will become an industrial designer. because you would be one that designs the industry at a different scale. Once again, this is all very well, but then you have to deal with curricula. And how do you organize a curriculum that does corporate management in construction as opposed to cost management in construction? So here we had to look at the food, at our diet within the curriculum. And we had to go back to fundamentals, essentially, to all the instructions that are normally given to us when we write curricula, certainly from the government, certainly with the Bologna model in Europe. And so there are, we all know there are 4 types of functional knowledge within academic curricula, particularly in the built environment. And what we wanted to try and decide was, how do you actually, as a student as well as an administrator, how do you grab that particular type of food? How do you get the ingredients together to come up with particular recipes? So in order to do this, we still had to use Le Corbusier's help, and we consider that we have our own ideal type, modulo. If you consider what that modulo does within a curriculum, there are 4 ways of gaining knowledge. One is by gaining discipline-supporting knowledge. You have to sustain what you're going to do next. The other one is to gain discipline-defining knowledge. What is at the bottom is the kernel of what you do. The third one is discipline-integrating knowledge. And the fourth one, that many people, I think, tend to sort of underrate, is discipline-positioning knowledge. If you don't know where you are as a professional, what chance do we stand to take action that will be successful? So there are these 4 types of knowledge, but of course these 4 types of knowledge are abstract categories. A curriculum does not simply work like that. It's not 1, 1, 1, 1, but there is a gradation of complexity and difficulty. And so this is what they are. Unfortunately, you can't read it. I could read it. I can read it very well. I could share my laptop with you, but it's not very practical. Anyway, so what we can say is that there is a basic level which provides grounds, facilitate the acquisition of tools, the understanding of relations, and the location of areas according to the various categories. Then you have to consolidate your grounders. You have to recognize the task and be able to implement them. Then you have to, if you know what the connections are, you need to be able to exploit them. And last but not least, if you want to be proficient about your discipline, you need to be able to make this stand. You have to be able to map the territory that you're part of. And then we get up to the next level, to the top level. If you can do all these things, then you can start building new grounds and new terrain. You can not only define operations, but also refine them and write down new objectives. And you can imagine links that are not yet there. And at the very far side, you can actually reflect on the existing geography, which is, I suppose, what one's doing here, and eventually try to modify it. Now, there's a number of things to say here. The first one is that traditionally our educational curricula tend to move on that side, and we leave the third and fourth column to particular schools or particular parts of the curricula. And it's very difficult to actually understand properly what a discipline positioning knowledge could be. So I'll give you an example. This is the most important plaque in my university, which is essentially inside the cloister of the building that I showed you. And it is where the 8-hour day was won in Victoria, and then moved on to the rest of Australia and became a milestone in the history of the labour movement. They were actually making that particular wall. And the reason why that event happened is because of the division of labour that had eventuated from the colony and the amount of skills, or the scarcity of skills, that was in Australia. So labour, construction labour in Australia had always much more power, possibly with the exception of America, but than in any other part of the world. And the history of technology and the history of the buildings that we see today has to do with this. Of course, if I ask any student, even graduate students, what that plaque represents, very few of them will be able to tell me. Another way of being critical or being able to position oneself, is to be able to understand the differences between a wall that was designed by Carlo Mollino for the Teatro Regio in 1968, with 4 different bricks and 2 workmen, and is one of the most sophisticated pieces of masonry engineering in the world, still standing very solidly, and another type of work that is possibly very sophisticated in terms of the forms, but in terms of the technological systems employed, this is Shop Architects' wall in Soho, is not nearly as sophisticated as the previous one. So one is technically difficult, the other one is technologically exuberant. How many people will be able to know the history behind these 2 things and understand the context that will bring the 2 elements together? There's another one down below with a slightly different connotation. So you have the Maggie's Pavilion, Charles Jenks' wife, in is it Nottingham or Manchester? I can't remember, sorry, I'm a bit... by Rogers, and the other one is the pavilion in Burkina Faso by Fare Studio Architects. He won the building for the award for best held building in the world in 2008 in Barcelona. Now, one building there cost $200,000, and the other one cost 20 or 30 times more. What impact do those... They're 2 exceptional buildings. This one, I think, won the Sterling Prize 3 years ago. 2 exceptional buildings. But when you look at the impact of exactly the same 4, and I know that no architect copied the other, it's uncanny resemblance, but still, it's part of the serendipity of design. Which one has more impact? And what is the, sort of the cost-return, investment yield ratio on these particular projects? Now, there is another component that makes this entire discussion slightly more complex, and it's the fact that not every university is the same. We tend to move away from that simple fact, but there is a series of features that belong in particular institutions and don't belong in others. Universities have different social missions, and we can recognize at least 4. Local institutions. They essentially train people to work. They're vocational in culture and they tend to serve a local community. Then we have national institutions that train people how to profess in practice rather than in theory. So they espouse professional cultures, and given that they need to be accredited to a much higher extent, tend to standardize their curricula as well. Then you have an international institution that professes in theory. And possibly these are the institutions that we recognize a bit more often with particular sides of loci of architectural education. Then we have supranational ones that have to do with particular disciplines. So a university school of architecture that may not have a full curriculum, but they're very, very good and specialize in doing a particular thing. When you look at this particular table in relation to those schools, well, one realizes that given that there are no subjects at the moment, so there are no labels to apply, it's just a strategy to decide and design, to sit down and put together. What you decide to do has to do with what your mandate is and what sort of territory and what sort of people you are serving. Because there is no doubt that no university in the world, no school in the world can be able to get to the top level in each and every category. It's simply impossible. We can't do it for the curriculum. The curriculum needs different steps, and we can't do it in terms of resources. And we can't do it in terms of the functional use of those resources. So essentially we have to understand who we are in order to design the curriculum in response to it. One possible way of doing that is by using a diagram like this. You have to have discipline supporting knowledge, which may not come from within the field. It depends on what sort of school you want to be. And so it's Le Modulor with double bricks. And then you have on the horizontal axis a discipline-defining curriculum and a position-defining curriculum. So something which is technical versus something which is critical. You can also decide that instead of moving towards the critical, you move up towards the technical. So you become a highly technical institution that can solve real problems, some people would say. Now, if we adopted this diagram, where would any institution be? Well, it is very likely that local vocational institutions would sit in that particular quadrant. And it's essentially the spine, the backbones of professional education, also because it serves a territory. I'm actually being very Gramscian in this. There has to be a certain degree of organicism between education and the serving of the territory around it. Then we could also say, look, if we are an institution which is very well located into the territory, then we know more about it than many other people. And therefore we can start becoming critical about ways of integrating that knowledge and making that knowledge serve that particular territory. So we are in a position to position ourselves. If we are a technical institution, we may want to go up. No time to waste about being critical and positioning, but we want to be good at what we do. We don't want to be nice, we want to be right. It is likely that when we do that, the moment you go further up, you tend to move towards the centre, because in order to be technically proficient today, you need to integrate your knowledge with that of other practices. And then if you want to be on the edge, then you may decide that you're going to select particular aspects of high technical culture and particular lenses through which one can look at them. Normally, when you look at these institutions, you can use this sort of diagram in your mind to label some of the institutions you know. That line tends to be quite narrow, because once again, you can't do it with everything, but you need to decide where you want to specialize. Now, what happens to the fourth quadrant? Can any university fill it? My answer personally is no. Universities cannot fill up that particular quadrant with the normal curriculum, simply because the constraints are too much. And in order to be able to be technically proficient and critically aware, you need to have done a lot of work. So for me, that is the domain, the province of research, which I consider absolutely relevant within architectural schools, as well as construction schools these days. This is essentially what we were trying to do with this particular program, trying to organize the various specialization from a how and what connotation to a what and a why. Those who do what and why may not be as ready to take up employment as the other ones, but they have a different employment path. But one of the things that happens is that even at that level, you will not be able to do what I'm suggesting one should do in that particular quadrant. It becomes only a training path towards that. And this is in fact what Duccio Turin had actually envisaged in his famous lecture. At one point he came up with this photograph and said, look, built environment education is like going to the Strait of Sicily. You have Scilla on one side and Cariddi on the other. Cariddi, where the two monsters would actually look after the waters, and Cariddi is on this side, is the shallow water in Sicily. And you can go through shallow water because you can see through. So you know where you're going. You may have a long way to go, but you know where you're going. Scilla is on the other side, the southern tip of Italy, and the water drops deeply down. So if you want to charter those waters, you really need to go down. And so for Turin, the idea was that the moment we start developing this discipline rigorously, we should have an undergraduate, call it master or postgraduate component, which is not research-based, and another one that is research-based and possibly connected to the other component. So this is what I've been trying to do, not only with the last 3 years, but possibly for the last 10 years. So I'm going to show you some of this work, and maybe it was serendipitous that we would all end up at the end of this crenellated war. One of the things that has characterized my work ever since I moved to UCLA and after I left for Australia is my interest in two things with regard to architecture and building. One is the worth of an idea, and that's why I'm using Le Corbusier's banknote. It's the only banknote currency in the world that has an idea rather than a building on its face. And what is the currency of that idea? And the other one is that with buildings and decisions that we made about designing them, what is that weight? How much do we have to do in order to change the industry? Do you change the industry by producing one very significant building? Or do you change it by becoming a volume builder and building 1 million of them? And so I've been trying to put these to use over the years, and I'm going to show you like 2 or 3 little things that I've done with the students along this line. The first one is 10 years ago. In 1999, East Timor, Timor-Leste, voted for independence, and the country was destroyed by Indonesian forces. So 2 years later, I actually set up, I've been teaching political economy of design for many years, so I set up a particular studio that had a number of clients in East Timor, and we tried to see what needed to be done. You couldn't design a building there. You had to, pick up a country and provide the infrastructure required for living. And so these are some examples. This is one project done by Evelyn Ching, who was one of the 10 Archibricks thesis, was published in Architectural Review in 2011, that took up a destroyed building in East Timor and turned it, in Dili, and turned it into a clinic for mothers and children. And the idea was that there was nothing around, so you had to go and physically collect pieces of tiles, blockwork, louvers. You had to make do. And make do not only as a way of providing shelter, but as a way of providing a new cultural dimension of life. This is another one. We used to work in groups, and so on the one hand, we needed to refurbish destroyed buildings. On the other, we needed to make sure that destroyed buildings could be refurbished. So the most important thing here was to set up a truck that could go around East Timor and provide extraordinary maintenance to those particular places. And this is essentially what one student did. Those were the trucks left behind by the Indonesians, and he retrofitted it in such a way as to turn the construction of water pumps and sanitary facilities into a social event for people that have been living around the hills in East Timor. Then we have another one, which is, if you look at this building here, this is an old building material supplier on the main road in Dili, and this was the subject of another person's thesis, Milinda Patirajas. As this thesis, he actually designed a building material supply facility. And you can see that the design is particularly successful. He was one of the winners of the Australian Student Biennale. And he tried to do it in such a way that this would become an opportunity to discuss and review all the technologies and the materials and the economy and the economics of that particular region when it came to building construction. So here you have a series of things that I don't have time to explain to you, but essentially everything here was dimensioned in such a way that couldn't be lifted up by gangs of 1 or 2 people and could be left in place without maintenance. At the same time, he wanted to provide a view for the future. So essentially, he borrowed some building types and repositioned them in Timor from Australia. The climate conditions are the same. And one other thing is that you try to build up an aesthetic out of functional elements. So this is essentially part of the storage place. And eventually housing. So the idea is that you have a microcosm there where people can learn and make decisions about the future. Now, one of the problems with this work, of course, is that it's so aesthetically pleasing that it's almost annoying, and one has to be harder and blunter with yourself. You can't become a victim of your own design or architectural skills, because some of the things that you may do here may look very good on paper, but not in the real world. And these students understood that. He graduated with great honours. He went to work. I had him work for 2 or 3 years teaching studios with me. And then he came back to do a master's and a PhD. And he decided to focus on Sri Lanka, because he comes from Sri Lanka, but also because Sri Lanka embodies perfectly the 4 lines, the conditions at the beginning. So you have a great architectural tradition, think of Geoffrey Bower, and also all the structural engineering that went in place after the 1950s, after independence. Then he actually is part of that group of countries that are going to explode because of urbanization pressures. So it's in the 3rd column. So one has to find an answer to urbanization pressures, particularly because in that group of country, urban slum production is happening at an incredible rate, which means that everyone that moves from rural areas will end up living in slums. Not only that, they will end up living in slums, but they will end up joining the construction industry because they are part of that 85%. So a certain vicious circle starts getting established that unless you do something about it, can't get out of it. So these were the 4 things: natural disasters, tsunami, war, conflict, the Civil War, economic restructuring as part of the same group, and of course urbanization pressures. From a planning point of view, that was going to have major changes, provide changes to urban and rural economy, would urbanize all the poor. So low-income earners will actually become poor in the city. It will separate labour market because you have such a large supply of market, then of course, if I am an entrepreneur, I would want to separate markets in such a way that I put the unskilled on one side and I only use the highly skilled on very few buildings. And because of that, I don't have enough money and I can't live in parts of the city that I was actually allowed to live in 20 years earlier. So you have women, you have children working in the construction industry, and at the same time the industry, the city grows at an incredible pace and haphazardly, without major planning, not only from a spatial point of view, but also from a techno-economic point of view. So 20 years, 30 years earlier, we would actually have the 1 million homes done by the government, low-cost housing. Today, the low-cost housing prerogative is no longer considered one of major governments, and that results in the creation of slums from which construction labour will come. When we go and look at the technological repercussions of that, we'll see the adoption of systems that are symbolically high, but functionally devastating. Sri Lanka is the country that imports the highest percentage of aluko bond in all of Southeast Asia compared to its population. So we have a country that went from very, very craft-based technologies to aluko bond, which is actually used to put a mask on something which is very badly done. And so the problem is not one of designing one nice building, but the problem is one of redesigning the industry and redesigning the country from this point of view. One of the things that happens to the industry that becomes rigid and sensitive. It's rigid because the social coalitions that are used to build tend to be separate for economic reasons. And the other thing is that they use systems that are not actually endogenous to that particular country, which makes them sensitive. So there is no room for error. There are no tolerances. So if you don't do something as you should be done, well, the building is not going to work. And because the labour skills are not flexible enough to come up to the challenge, then the entire building fabric will collapse. And so this particular work, instead of PhD, started to look at design as a way of say, look, it's not about the building. It's about making sure that we design things across the market in such a way that labour can move from slums to social housing, to commercial buildings, to public institutional, all the way to high institutional, so that we design details in such a way as to make sure that bridges are provided within the markets for people to acquire skills and transfer them somewhere else. So this was essentially the idea, the architectural idea. So it's not the architecture of the building, it was the architecture of the industry. So what you have to do here is not designing programs, but designing micro elements that can actually be transferred from one building to the other, almost irrespective of the program, but because of the socioeconomic conditions. One of the things that we have to be very careful about is that once you design a detail that someone can implement on a construction site, there is enough tolerance for that detail to be moved onto a project which is more complex. Because if you don't know how to make up the next step, you will risk making an error and causing a failure. If you cause a failure onto that building site, no one will hire you. So another thing that one had to do here was completely opposite to what we would consider to be the norm in architecture. You don't design precisely. The craft here is not about being precise, but about being sloppy. So you have to allow for errors in your buildings, because if you can't make errors, people will not be able to work. So these were architectural questions. Can architecture then act as an engine of social and economic growth for those involved in building production, not for the clients, for the people that build them, the 85%? And can we plan specific building technology strategically in such a way as to create in turn professional frameworks, architects, engineers, planners, that are capable of helping us narrow the gap between high-quality architectural production, Jeffrey Bauer, Nanette da Silva, middle-quality commercial building, essentially from China or India, and low-quality shelter supply, slums. So one of the things that you have to do here, you can't design. You have to go on the field and understand what is to be done. And you have to do it because architectural theory, or building theory, has none of it. And so essentially what we did was to go and look at the number of buildings that had to do with particular quantities of money per square meters, and then look at them in terms of different categories. So here, if a building costs this much, what sort of environmental parameters are considered as part of the program? By default, not by design. And you design that. And then something else. Essentially, here we have the same types of buildings, and here the sort of supply logics is because people are in a condition that can't accept anything else, or because people make a choice as to what they want. And if they make a choice about this, how much would the building cost? And so forth. At the end of this, and I'll only have 5 minutes, at the end of this, so at the end of a very precise, annoying almost, analysis of these buildings, we decided, and I say we decided because this was part of a work that we did as a group, that you can actually work on 4 technologies in Sri Lanka that can be moved right across the entire market, still. And what you have to focus on is welding and cutting. Concrete paneling, the way of casting, how you put the mix together. Concrete framing, the way you do it off-site. And concrete block work, how you manufacture and assembly. We had to develop a language for this. And what is the language for technologies that have no language in their own right? And so the language came out of understanding the mistakes and what is tolerable within those particular building configurations. And essentially the entire thing then will turn around and start producing solutions that could be made viable by the socio-technical conditions. Now, once we did that, we then had to make decisions as to what to do with those technologies. So this is only showing the one with steel. If we use tubular steel, that has to be welded in particular ways. As you move across the markets with task complexity and labor skills, then the detail has to change. So now the matter is to find projects where we can apply this technology. And so what we did was to go back to Colombo, look at the labor pools, essentially slums, and look at buildings that were being built at the very time that would actually belong to different markets. And the fact that they were being built was critical. And then we said, okay, well, look, let's set up, design a technological trajectory on each one of those buildings that by themselves define those markets. So essentially those colors identified how a particular technology has been applied to a particular building at what level. So I'll show you one, for instance. This is the lowest possible level, which was a single room occupancy for people that would come to the station. Rather than living at the station, they could actually get something here. So the only thing that we wanted to do was to give them some basic skills about steel welding in order to make very little interventions. And so this is the building on the right, only concrete, steel framing and fabric all around it. And then the design was about deciding where those interventions had to be made, how the building sites would be organized. So here you have very informal building sites because you only have 1 or 2 people doing it. So essentially the entire building can become a building site even after it's built. And then we start deciding or designing the conditions of production. So, the most important parts of the design here are the design of the tolerances. So what is the concept and what is allowed? How precise can you be? Then what is the construction site like and what is the labor gang? Remember that the labor gang here is very low. What are the materials and what are the training procedures? Then we can move to another part, which has to do with the security grill here or with the back racks, and we'll do exactly the same thing. Then we'll move to another section of the market which is slightly higher, so you can see that technology goes up. And this is an image that I showed you before. You can't keep producing curtain walls like that, otherwise the entire place will go down. And it's very humid, let me tell you. And so you have to do something that ventilates. Not only ventilates, but stays independent from the other components. So here we took the liberty of borrowing from Koenig-Eisenberg building in Pittsburgh, but with variations that have to do with that particular climate. And so here the building site is a different one. The materials are similar, because they have to be similar, just a bit more complex in terms of their treatment, and these are the instructions. So at the end of this, we went through the entire industry and we started to fill up the architecture that could respond to those technological situations or technological necessities, and we did it for steel, for concrete paneling, for concrete framing, and concrete bulkwork. And essentially what happens when you do this, we didn't start from an architectural point of view, but we set up a different form of critical regionalism. Because it's certainly regional, and it certainly has to be critical. Otherwise, there would be no reason for any one of these moves. But interestingly, by doing this, then you become closer, once again, to some of the prototypes or some of the archetypes of that particular place which have been taken up or taken away from recent events. Now, why did I say that we have to do that design once buildings were constructed? Because at one point, there is no use in doing this academically, and the pun is intended, if you can't convince the industry that they can do it. So we asked for some collaboration from the National Institute of Labour Training, and they had their quantity surveyors that did the bill of quantities for our projects. And after the projects were finished, we put them next to the normal buildings. So these were the buildings that we were trying to replace. And our buildings came down 10% cheaper than the others, not even consider that there were positive externalities in labour training. There are other things that I'm not going to show you here, but what happened to this particular project? Well, 2 weeks ago it was announced that this student's project won the Royal Institute of British Architects President's Award for Outstanding PhD thesis. And it is a PhD in construction. It's not a PhD in architecture. And this is the motivation of the jury. It's a huge and far-reaching study that addressed the very real problems of meaningful, lasting, and achievable development across the developing world. But which applies equally, the things, the concepts behind them, equally apply to the UK context. And as a groundbreaking, cross-disciplinary investigation, it is an excellent example of how research that joins up issues across the construction industry may be carried out. After that, we went back, in the meantime actually been invited back in Sri Lanka, as Margaret was mentioning, for the 50th anniversary of the architectural school, and we started a collaboration. This is the most recent one, 2 or 3 weeks ago, coming of age. Because we're coming of age, the school is 50, I turned 50 as well, we want to have a conversation about what constitutes community in architecture and construction, what are the values that need to be shared, but above all, what are the horizons that are possible. So as a result of this, the government gave us a small grant, a seed grant, to explore how to apply these PhD findings to the fabric, which is growing at an incredible pace along the arterial roads. So over the next year and a half, we'll be actually putting students, undergraduates, masters, teachers that will work as PhD under me at Melbourne University, so they will come back, be able to go back to Sri Lanka and restart the cycle that Melinda started, and eventually be in a position to tell them there are certain things that are only symbolic in nature but have no value for that particular place. It's interesting that we're actually taking students that come from the university that takes all the students in first year to the stupas, because they want them to learn how to survey a building and understand what is material about a particular building. One of the problems that we found is that they stop there. So they develop this obsessive respect for the temples, and they forget about the religion. So here, the problem is not about designing temples, but is about designing religiously at different scales of interventions. And the moment you do that, and what you decided, in fact, is not so much about architecture, is not so much about construction, but about building these bridges that once you're in there, they're a bit flimsy, but they seem natural. And so in conclusion, that essentially allows me to go back to Brutus' allegiance, and whether in fact it is a false problem, something that has been fabricated culturally, or whether it's something that we should consider seriously. In this particular case, it was never a problem, and the more you did about the work of construction, the closer you got to design and the use of design. Of course, one of the things that remains that needs to be possibly spelt out. One has to do with the fact that all this was done under a PhD group. And I still have this group of PhDs that work around the world on these particular issues that bring together design and construction. Could it be done? Not at a PhD level. And I think my response to it would be no. And it would be no because I actually followed students that have been with me or professionals who've been with me for 10 or 15 years and see how much they've grown over time in order to be able to provide this response. The second thing, can we actually adopt this as a model and apply it? And I think the answer from my personal position is no. I've been doing this in Melbourne for a number of years. I'll be doing this again at the École Polytechnique next year at a different level because we are near Geneva. And so I want to do this in order to show funding agencies that they can do it. And I'm doing that in Colombo, in Sri Lanka, with undergraduate students in order to show them that, in fact, once again, the bricks are important, but there are other things in the world that they should look at. And last but not least, of course, this poses you, or sort of presents you with the challenge, because the moment you go up there, and we've been up there, you realize that the vista that you get is amazing. And you can actually see the entire built environment before you or below you. And by doing that, then you realize what the value, what the responsibility, and you wonder about the viability of what you do. And so you're actually left to ponder there like one of those monkeys that are very, very social, so they could always go back to their group. But some of them stay there and look out. And there is no doubt that what one does here is worth it. But is it possible? So the only thing that I can do, I can say, that I can leave with the words, with another man from Argentina, a very, very iconic one, that once said that we have no choice. Because we try. If we try, we may lose. But if we don't try, we have already lost. Thank you.